Okay, so we just moved on from the non-vascular plants or the mosses, and now we'll move on to the spore-producing or seedless. They're technically called the seedless plants, but I like to call them by what they are, the spore-producing vascular plants. So they have vascular tissue like the seed plants do, but instead of reproducing with seeds, they're reproducing with spores. And as you can see on this phylogeny, another paraphyletic group of life. Now we're going to focus on the ferns, and each of these individual groups, like the club mosses, whisk ferns, horsetails, they're all fern-like. They all basically have a lot of similarities in common. We're going to focus on the ferns, and each of these is technically like a phylum, but in plants and botany we call them divisions instead of phyla. But it's the same concept, just they use different term for plants than animals. And each individual phylum or division, true of all of these, is thought to be monophyletic. Okay, but the group as a whole, the spore-producing or seedless vascular plants, that group is paraphyletic. Okay, so let's see if we can predict how they're going to live. They live on land, but now they have vascular tissue, and so they're going to have leaves. They're going to have better stomata. They're going to have vascular cells. They can move fluids. They're not going to be super woody yet. The wood, as we think of wood, really evolves here, but they're woodier. They have lignin. They have truer roots. So let's see how this works by focusing on the ferns. Um, so the synapomorphy of the vascular plants that also includes the seed plants is our good friend vascular tissue. Lignin, not necessarily wood, but the precursor you need to make wood, but they're reproducing, at least this group here, the non-vascular, or sorry, the seedless vascular plants in the old-fashioned way with spores rather than seeds. This is a fern. This is our poster child of the seedless vascular plants. And like the moss, there's a really enormous diversity of these. And I'll show you a sense of the diversity. But again, more than 10,000 species. There's about as many species of ferns as there are mosses and as there are birds. So a really successful group of life. Typically, you can make an intuitive sense they're going to be bigger because they have vascular tissue. It allows fluids, sap, water to pass through the body over greater distances, which means they're going to be able to support themselves with their lignin. They're going to get taller, they can move fluids and get more sunlight in the process. They do have leaves. Technically, we call them macrophyls, but we can just call them true leaves. These are the first group of life of plants, at least, with true leaves. They grow in an interesting way. As a plant at the root, they unroll their stems in what's called a fiddlehead, and then each of the individual sets of leaves also unrolls in a fiddlehead manner. It's called a fiddlehead because if you look at the head of a violin, the strings are down here, you play it down here, but you hold your fingers along the fingerboard up here. The head up here, kind of that holds the tension, is called the fiddlehead. It's the head of a fiddle, of a violin, and kind of has that kind of rolled appearance. And then you can see the individual leaves roll. Food connection. Some people, especially in France and parts of Asia, will eat these before, when they're very young, like down in here, they don't have a lot of lignin yet. And so they're not very woody. And so they're kind of like a carrot, a little crunchy. And often they're pickled. And you can kind of eat them as if they're a pickle. That's the traditional French way. Reproductively, the sporangium, remember this is going to be sporophyte dominant, so the fern itself is the sporophyte. On the underside of the leaves, when they're sexually mature, when they're ready to do meiosis, is a cool sporangium called a sorus. One sorus, two sori. I'll show you, but these are basically the places on the leaves, on the underside of the leaf, where meiosis occurs. The roots of these are deeper penetrating, they're woodier, they can push deeper in the dirt than in moss, but they're still called rhizoids. They don't really go very deep. It's more shallow and superficial types of roots, but able to drink a lot of water. They still need to be around a lot of moisture in order to survive. Again, they're not as terrestrialized as the seed plants are, with their really true roots and very sophisticated vascular cells. Reproductively, we're sporophyte dominant, and here the gametophyte is its own almost microscopic separate phase. So they kind of have two very different organisms within a single life cycle. Just like before, they need moisture, both for survival, but also for reproduction, for the sperm to leave the antheridium and swim into the archegonium. And like the mosses, still need a lot of moisture, shade. They just are able to be taller. Now, there is one weird group of ferns called the tree ferns that we'll talk about, and they are kind of an experiment in being a true tall tree, like a 50-foot tall tree. And we have a good fossil record of those, and we'll talk about them a little bit too. But in North America, they don't really exist there. You have to go to Central America, Australia, Africa to really see those in Asia. Okay, so that's the world of ferns, which is our poster child of the early vascular plants, the spore-bearing vascular plants. So let's see some pictures of these. Reproductively, we've got our small gametophyte, really almost microscopic. You can see it if you're looking for it, but very hard to see. Only less than like a postage stamp in size, sometimes much smaller. They have the antheridium that makes the sperm. They have the archegonium that makes the egg. They have to wait for moisture or be a moist environment. The sperm swims into the archegonium, fertilizes the egg. We start our sporophyte, retained in the parent archegonium. It grows out and then it grows leaves so it can feed for itself. Mosses couldn't do that. Feeds on its own, and then the the gametophyte has done its job. It shrivels up and dries and falls off as dead, and the sporophyte takes over. It's going to grow rhizoids to drink more water, has some vascular cells that can get bigger and move that fluid a greater distance. When it's big and sexually mature, on the underside of the leaf, it says sporangium, but you should write sorus. These special sporangia that look like little capsules open up, and just like before they produce spores, they're released in the wind. They're covered with a chemical called sporopollenin. They won't dry out, and the cycle starts over. So when you see a fern, what you're seeing is the sporophyte, unlike in the mosses, where you were focused on the gametophyte. There's been a big transition here with the vascular plants to sporophyte dominant. Why? Still big mystery. We just simply don't know. Okay, and so there's huge diversity. That's not a fern. This is either a fox or a dog. I can't tell. But these are the ferns. Relatively bigger than mosses, but still relatively small plants compared to you. They like shade and moisture and rainy areas, and they can go up into dry Canadian conditions, but again, it needs to be very damp and a little bit swampy, not too swampy, and moist and shady. Um, okay, so this is the world of ferns. This looks like a four-leaf clover, but it's a fern. If you look on the underside, it has sporangia that are sorry. It produces spores. Ferns are flowering, sorry, clovers are flowering plants, so clovers produce flowers. These don't. They don't have seeds. They produce spores, and so it's called the four-leaf clover fern rather than a true four-leaf clover. You can see a lot of diversity in the leaf structure. If you look on the underside, this is my favorite thing to do when I find a fern. Like literally every fern I find, I'm going to flip the leaf over and look, and these little brown spots, sometimes they're isolated dots, sometimes there's rows, sometimes they're lines, sometimes they're clusters. Really, really cool. These are the special sporangia. This is where meiosis is occurring. This is where the first part of genetic recombination of sex is happening in these plants. The spores get released and the cycle starts over. I love sori. The sori arrangements turn out to be really important for recognizing and identifying species. Every species kind of has its own sorus. Again, when you mess with reproduction, have mutations that change sex, often that's going to result in sexual differences, sexual reproductive isolation. You get speciation very quickly when you mess with sex. Okay, now in North America, you're not going to see these. You got to go to Central America or the tropics on Earth. And there are ferns that kind of get woodier and almost converge on being a tree. So this is kind of like an experiment in being a tree. Remember, there's a lot of convergent pressure. To be a tall, big plant, you get more sunlight. And especially in tropical conditions, especially rainforests, where there's a lot of moisture, you can get bigger and not dry out. And so this group here is rare on Earth today, but is kind of a forest of ferns. Really cool environment. And if you look, they still have the fiddleheads. If you look under the leaves when they're mature, they have the sori. They kind of look like palm trees, but they are not palm trees. Palm trees are flowering plants. This is kind of an experiment in being a tree. And the fossil record of ferns is especially these kinds of plants. So if you go back in Illinois, 300 million years ago into what's called the Carboniferous period. Carbon means coal, and coal means lots of plant matter that's been fossilized. These ancient tropical rainforests in Illinois really are dominated by these plants. I'm going to do a separate module just on the coal in Illinois because it's a really interesting little kind of story. But they're made up by and large of these plants, although there are some mosses and a few other weird kinds of plants. But these are the fossils, and typically they look like hollow stems. In a lot of ways, these plants here are also closely related to these groups here called the horsetails that have this thick, long stem that's hollow. So it's not just ferns that make up the coal deposits, but these seedless vascular plants collectively, of which ferns are a really successful modern group. But there were a huge fossil record of these, and whenever you're burning electricity in Illinois, you're using coal often. It's coming from deposits of these. Okay, for our next set of modules, we'll focus on the seed plants.